Perfect. Okay. So let's welcome Ben Yuan from online from the UK. Give him some. And you can hear the sounds, right? Although you cannot see us.
I can hear, yes.
Yeah. Could you hear Pen clearly? Okay. So yeah, Pen, feel free to start.
All right. So thank you so much, Professor Chen, for inviting me to be here with you today to share some of my reflections on a very popular topic in technology. So as Professor Chen was alluding to, my original training is in ecology and conservation research. I used to spend a lot of time with wildlife. But later on, I moved on to advocating for more open practices in how we do scientific research. And that led me to a lot of my current research at the University of Bristol in the UK, looking at ways of reforming academic institutions to make our research environment more conducive to more open practices. But it was during these years that I also became really connected with a lot of grassroots tech communities, including open source communities here in Europe. And through this experience, I gained some of the reflections that I would like to share with you today in terms of so-called artificial intelligence. And I've been lucky to contribute to some initiatives here. For example, I was recently a fellow of Aspiration Tech's AI openness and equity cohort, which looked at a lot of justice and equity issues in this technology. So when it comes to so-called artificial intelligence, this term is actually not new. One of the first recorded or documented use of the term can be traced back to 1955, when a research proposal was made to get some money to organize a meeting for computer scientists and mathematicians, and they wanted to find a catchy term that would really get the attention of the funders. So this was more than 70 years ago. But during this whole time, so-called artificial intelligence has never been used to refer to a coherent set of technologies. When you talk about this, are you talking about machine learning, natural language processing, computer vision, neural networks, etc.? There are so many buzzwords in this very, very broad field, and there has never been a very clear definition or delineation of the boundaries of what this term means. And one of the messages that will be throughout my talk today is the fact that artificial intelligence is very much a marketing term instead of a technical term of art. And I'm going to keep coming back to this point throughout my talk today. And I like to split my talk into the following 5 sections, starting with my argument for why so-called artificial intelligence is actually not intelligent. Then talk about why this is so important to understand and why that matters so much about how we use these technologies. But I think more importantly comes after this, which is that whether it's what we might call artificial intelligence or other technologies, it is a projection of power. And those power dynamics and unequal power dynamics can have a lot of unintended consequences or sometimes intended consequences. The other thing is to zoom out a little bit and think about so-called artificial intelligence as automation and how automation has affected society in so many different ways. And finally, I will try to reflect on some of the things we can do about the problems that we're going to be talking about today. So starting with how artificial intelligence is actually not intelligent, I want to start with an example in natural language processing. And this is actually the subfield in computer science that most people think about when they actually talk about so-called AI. And within that, I want to start with a very simple example. So on the word processors that we use on our computers to type, let's say, you're typing English, right? This function has been around for decades, to help you spell your words correctly. And to get past the hype, we should realize that what's often called artificial intelligence is foundationally similar to the Spellcheck function in word processors. So many, many years ago, when you were typing up your document, very early on, the function of the Spellcheck is that it will check the words that you are typing against a built-in dictionary. And if there is not a match, then the word processor will highlight your misspelling with that famous red underline, right? Now, later versions of Spellcheck, when they check against that dictionary, might suggest, words that are close to what you've spelled on the screen, to what's in the dictionary, and then it gives you a list of words to choose from. And by the way, in the 4 words that I'm sharing on the screen right now, the first one is aura. That is actually a real word. It is the name of a kind of parrot, which is kind of ironic given what I'm about to get to later in this talk. But anyway, all of these are real words, but at this point, the spell check actually has no idea what word you're actually trying to spell in the sentence. However, where natural language processing really comes in is that one of the things it does is that it looks at the statistical relationships between a bunch of different words in its original training data. And it's able to look at the words that come before and after the word that has been underlined in red to suggest what the most likely word that you're actually trying to type is. Right? So this is very much based on statistical models, how these spell check suggestions work. And as a side note, this is not limited to English. So for example, for Chinese speakers who type using phonetic symbols like bopomofo, it is actually the same principles that allow the input system to suggest which Chinese characters that you're trying to type. So similar natural language processing principles there. And if you look at this entire field, I talk about Spellcheck because within this big realm of natural language processing, one of the technologies that was developed is called large language models, right? And they are essentially a very, 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 very advanced version of Spellcheck. And within large language models, some of the most advanced ones are called generative pre-trained transformers. So the short version of that is GPT. And this is actually where the GPT in ChatGPT comes from. Within all of these large language models, what we have to realize is that they are trained on billions and billions of pieces of existing text to statistically model the relationships between all of those little pieces of text. They're called tokens in the training data. And this requires a lot of computational power. It takes a lot of time to train these large language models. And what happens when you quote unquote talk to a chatbot, let's say, you ask how it is doing, right? What's actually happening is that the chatbot is going back into the statistical model to do statistical inference to guess what the next set of words should be based on the inputs that you've given it. So what you see as the output is the result of all of these statistics. Now, for those of you who are computer scientists, you are probably going to complain that this is an oversimplification of how large language models work. But what I'm describing is this overall principle, which is that large language models they look at the statistical relationships between words and use statistical probabilities to estimate what the next word could be based on the words that came before and the next word and the next word after that, right? And what is critical to everything I've said so far is that these statistical relationships between the words have no reference to any meaning or understanding. And that is why Professor Emily Bender calls these large language models stochastic parrots. So Emily Bender is a prominent professor in the field of computational linguistics. And I think this is a great analogy, because if you think about a real parrot, the parrot might make a series of sounds that sound like human speech, but the parrot has no understanding of what any of those sounds mean. So imagine if the parrot makes a series of sounds that sound like the sky is green to us. Well, it actually doesn't matter whether if it says the sky is green or the sky is blue. As far as the parrot is concerned, it is just making that series of sounds. It is us making meanings of the sounds and figuring out whether it is correct or not. And the same idea applies to large language models because it simply generates text based on a set of inputs. So if the large language model happens to output a piece of text that says the sky is blue, it is us, again, making sense of that output, not the large language model. So, I spent all of this time talking about how large language models and so-called artificial intelligence, have no understanding of meaning, right? Whether AI is smart or dumb is the wrong question to ask, because these technologies, they literally have no intelligence to speak of. So why does all of this matter? And I think that they matter a lot because words matter. And misunderstanding so-called artificial intelligence affects how we use these tools. The seductiveness of so-called artificial intelligence makes us miss the point of why we do what we do. And when we give up on this thinking, we forget why we do certain things. And there are so many examples of a lot of the absurdities that happen, such as saying academic research. So this is a paper that proposes to replace humans with large language models in qualitative research. So the general idea is that if I'm a social scientist or a qualitative researcher, I will go out in real life and maybe interview a bunch of real people, but that is so much work, it takes so much time, right, to recruit participants in my study. And it proposes that, hey, well, we can use large language models to replace these human samples, and we can ask the large language models to pretend to be different kinds of people, and we can interview them. They will never grow tired of our interviewing, and it will save us so much time and money and all of that. When this whole time, like I said, these large language models cannot even think or understand, which leads me to, I think, a very important paper written by Lisa Masseri and Molly Crockett, which talks about how these misunderstandings of how these technologies work will make us vulnerable to illusions of understanding. And it leads to a lot of cognitive traps in different kinds of research, including in science or otherwise. And it can become very problematic. And frankly, I think all of the hype is making researchers waste so much time and important resources when they could have been spending that on something else. So in research, this could be a problem, and then it can also be a problem in education. So I've heard on multiple occasions anecdotes from graduate programs in different universities, where, let's say, a student is applying to a PhD program, right, at a certain university. But it is so competitive, they have to write so many PhD applications, they don't have time to do that. So they write down a few bullet points, and then they ask a chatbot to turn those bullet points into a cover letter for their PhD applications. And when that's sent to the university, the professors at the university, they're also really overwhelmed and they don't have time to read all of the applications. So they actually ask the same chatbots to turn those PhD application essays back into bullet points so that they can just look at the bullet points. Now, this is a kind of absurd and funny example, but if you really think about it, education is a very complex social relationship where a caring teacher, they develop a genuine understanding of their students and work with them through the process of learning. But so-called artificial intelligence, if you're talking about chatbots, they reduce this relationship down to just a set of words, as if the words alone represent the entirety of education. Now, we have seen, of course, students using chatbots to write their essays, and there are also reports that teachers are using the same chatbots to grade those essays. Yes, there are ethical concerns here, but I think it's more than that, right? It's also about how there's a growing corpus of research that says the use of large language models, they erode critical thinking because we offload all of that to these machines which cannot think, and they affect our cognitive abilities. But even deeper than that, I like to get back to what Emily Bender talks about, which is that in one of the lectures she gave at a UNESCO meeting earlier this year, to say that the value of education is in the words themselves is profoundly disrespectful to both teachers and students. It erases the work and expertise of teaching and paints students as unworthy of caring mentors who help them grow their critical thinking. I think that it's very, very telling that in some parts of the world, in very, very expensive private schools that only the richest people can attend, those schools would actually advertise that we promise we're not going to use any artificial intelligence in our education. We're going to have a lot of one-on-one interactions between the human teachers and the human students, right? So if that's what those expensive private schools say, then what does it say when all of these so-called AI companies say that, oh, we're going to improve education by pushing this into all of the normal public schools that we go to? So this is in education, but sometimes the issues are literally life and death. The hype of so-called AI is affecting nursing in this hospital. So this is a report in Coda where they interviewed Michael, a nurse who works in the intensive care unit for neurology at a hospital in San Diego in the United States, in California. And this story, Michael was talking about how they are replacing people in the medical profession with these statistical models that cannot think. And what they would do is that they would take some of the sensor readings from different patients to calculate a number for each patient that represents their status. Now, first of all, this was really frustrating because, Michael felt that when he sees these numbers, he doesn't actually have a sense of how severe the situation is for that patient. And by reducing a patient down to a number, it misses a lot of the subtleties in diagnosis and judgment that cannot be quantified and analyzed with a statistical model. And it's an insult to the professional judgments and medical professionals who can actually think and make decisions and actually care about your patients. Now, what's even more ironic is that there was this report released by MIT also just earlier this year, where they looked at 300 business initiatives in incorporating AI into different businesses. I believe it's in the US. And they've found that after time, 95% of these organizations report that they're getting exactly zero return on investment in all of this so-called AI stuff that they're doing. So all of this is to explain why it matters so much to understand that so-called artificial intelligence technologies are not intelligent. But I think there are issues much more important than simply understand what a technology is and how to use or not use it, right? And that is why I think it's crucial for us to consider how the use of technology is a projection of power. So some people would say that technology is neutral, a tool is neutral. It's just a matter of how you use the tool, kind of like a knife, right? For a knife, I can use it to chop vegetables, or I won't, but I could use it to stab someone. Now, in a very, very, very narrow sense of the word, I suppose you could say that a tool is neutral. But if we think that, then I think we miss the bigger picture. So getting back to so-called artificial intelligence, as I said before, the term is very ambiguous, right? And I think that ambiguity in the language makes us give up our voice in defining it and ceding that power to the people who control these technologies. And they use this power to conceal some inconvenient truths behind these so-called artificial intelligence technologies. I mentioned that large language models are basically statistics that quantify the probabilistic relationships between pieces of text. And what this means is that chatbots based on these large language models have a probability of producing what we might see as nonsense or incorrect outputs, right? Such as that stochastic parrot saying the sky is green. And this is what people often refer to as hallucinations. But this is another very misleading term, because the training process for these large language models require human workers to label the data sets and correct mistakes. And these technologies themselves, have no perception. So there isn't even the potential for hallucinations to begin with. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do, and it's humans doing the work. So to give you a sense of what I mean, most of you have probably seen, this challenge that you have to complete when you visit certain websites. This is called a CAPTCHA. This particular one is reCAPTCHA, which is run by Google. And, you have to tick the boxes representing all of the pictures that have traffic lights in them, right? Now, this is a kind of data labeling. We are actually all doing this data labeling work for training AI models for Google. And this might look like a relatively trivial and mundane piece of work to do that takes you 5 seconds. But there are huge numbers of sweatshop workers who manually label training data behind the facade that is so-called artificial intelligence. So for ChatGPT, these sweatshop workers were hired in Kenya to tag and filter out text that describes extremely graphic details like sexual abuse, murder, suicide, or even torture. And they have to look at this stuff all day and being paid less than $2 per hour just to make the outputs of ChatGPT a little less toxic, right? And it is actually more than that. So in another report by Coda, they interviewed some of the click workers who live in Nairobi in Kenya. And in this case, these workers, they're not only processing text, but also images and videos for these so-called AI companies. And one of the workers they interviewed is named Mercy, and she worked for Meta for a while, which is the company behind Facebook, and a big player in the so-called AI space these days. And in the interview, she said that when she goes to work every day for hours and hours and hours and hours, you could see people committing suicide live on video. I also saw a video of a very young kid being raped live. And you're here, you have to watch all of this stuff. And you have your own kids, and you are thinking about them as you try to do all of this work. So these are the human data labelers and click workers who are behind the facade of so-called artificial intelligence. But this kind of work also takes other forms. it is actually not just large language models or so-called generative AI. So let's take the example of the Amazon Fresh supermarket. So I'm based in the UK right now, and I actually took this picture of the Amazon Fresh supermarket, which is about 200 meters south of the Aldgate East Underground Station in London. And the way Amazon Fresh works is that if you walk into the supermarket, it looks pretty normal at first glance, right? But when you look up to the ceiling, you will see there are rows and rows of these cameras pointed at you. And the marketing behind Amazon Fresh is that you can just go, to any of the shelves, pick up whatever you want to get, and you can just walk out of the supermarket. And Amazon claimed that their very, very advanced so-called artificial intelligence will automatically recognize what you took out of the supermarket and charge your Amazon account so that you don't have to spend time, lining up at the till and paying for it. So you can just walk out with the things that you buy. Well, it turned out that last year, some investigative reporting, as reported by Ars Technica, found out that the so-called artificial intelligence never really worked. This whole time, Amazon actually hired more than 1,000 human video reviewers in India, where those video reviewers, they're just sitting in front of a computer and watching the feeds from those cameras in the supermarkets and manually marking which things you have picked out of the shelves. So eventually, Amazon actually stopped marketing Amazon Fresh as artificial intelligence, and they actually added these things. When you walk out, you actually have to scan on your own and pay before you leave, and then it becomes a lot more like a quote-unquote normal supermarket. And speaking of Amazon, there's another thing I want to quickly talk about, which is the Amazon Echo. So it is one of those so-called smart speakers where you stick one of these in your house, right? And then it's plugged to the internet, and it comes with the Alexa smart assistant, and you can ask a lot of questions of it. You can ask it to do things like play music. You can ask about the weather or other questions of Amazon Echo. But who are the laborers behind this small piece of technology that feels almost magical when you talk to it? Well, there is an artificial intelligence researcher called Kate Crawford, and she published this amazing map, or what she calls the anatomy of an AI system based on the Amazon Echo smart speaker. So she made a very, very detailed case study that looked at all of the materials and human labor that props up the Amazon Echo. And it became a very, very complex map of all of the material and human extraction that goes into producing that answer the Amazon Echo can give you when you ask it a question. And I think Kate Crawford says it really well when she said that AI is neither artificial nor intelligent in her book Atlas of AI. What we call AI is built on human labor, and it cannot work at all without that labor constantly propping it up. And that is certainly not intelligent in the way humans are. So words really matter because they have epistemic power. They affect the way we think. And these so-called AI companies use this power to conceal the hidden sweatshop labor that's actually used to create this illusion of intelligence. It is a smokescreen that makes us think that it is the technology doing the thinking. There's another professor called Lily Irani, right, who said really well that instead of machines replacing us, it is actually displacing labor and making it even more invisible. And I think it's very important for us to realize that. So I just talked about how the language and use of so-called artificial intelligence technologies is a projection of power. In this case, it is to make it feel like this magical thinking machine that can do everything when it actually hides displaced human labor. And to zoom out, even more from this, I think it is then helpful to consider so-called AI in terms of automation, broadly speaking. And to do that, I like to come back to nursing. So there was this report released by the Roosevelt Institute in December 2024 that studied the proliferation of these so-called, AI apps that are essentially Uber, but for nurses. So how this works is that in the past, in a lot of American hospitals, they will hire nurses as full-time employees, right? And then as full-time employees, it will come with all of the benefits of being an employee, including employee and labor protections. However, the hospitals, they wanted to save costs, so they wanted to fire a lot of their nurses. And what this eventually turned into are these Uber-like apps where the hospital would be kind of like the equivalent of the passenger on the Uber ride, and the hospital will use the app to say, okay, so for today, for this shift, from 9 in the morning to, I don't know, like 6 in the afternoon, we need, 10 nurses, right? For example. And then the nurses who are equivalent to the Uber drivers, they will use the same app to bid on those shifts at the hospital. And the nurses are actually required to outbid each other, where the nurse who's willing to take the lowest pay, they will win the bid and they will get the shift, right? So it is bidding down to the lowest possible pay, and it makes the nurses compete with each other to take that lowest pay. But it actually goes even more than this bidding process, which is already pretty stressful, even when I think about it. So the other things that happen is that, first of all, these nurses, they often have to buy and bring their own uniforms. So sometimes the different hospitals, they have different uniform or scrubs requirements. And these nurses also have to buy and maintain some of their own medical equipment. So it's less cost for the hospital to maintain this because all of those costs have been now shifted onto these nursing gig workers. The other thing is that, let's say the number of patients change at the last minute at the hospital, and then the hospital feels, we don't really need that many nurses anymore. So they will actually cancel some of the shifts for the nurses, and then the nurses will lose out on potentially an entire days of work. And what's even more infuriating for me is that these Uber for nursing apps, they will buy a lot of really intimate and personal data about these nurses, and they would try to learn as much as possible about these gig work nurses. So for example, if this app sees that a particular nurse has a lot of credit card debt, then it will actually offer that nurse even less pay, because they know that this nurse is really desperate to make some money to pay off their credit card debt. So they will accept, however little money that the app is willing to pay. So, this is a kind of surveillance on healthcare workers, but more broadly speaking, it is called a type of algorithmic wage discrimination. So this is a term coined by a law professor called Vina Dubel, and she wrote a very influential paper in the Columbia Law Review about this, right? Because algorithmic wage discrimination, uses a lot of these personal data and very intimate surveillance that these so-called artificial intelligence do on people to pay different people different wages for doing the same work. And I think this is, a very, a big problem that is becoming more prevalent and amplified by so-called artificial intelligence. Another domain that I like to talk about are self-driving vehicles. I put them in quotes because sometimes really silly things happen. So Google has a very big subsidiary company called Waymo. So they have these so-called self-driving taxis. And there was this viral video from a couple of years ago where someone who lived very close to a parking lot with all of these self-driving taxis, they were live streaming, all of these taxis getting into a huge jam because they couldn't figure out how to get out of the parking lot. Now you can say that this is just a silly fluke, and it's just a matter of perfecting the technology. And that might be true. In fact, in April of 2024, there was this new driverless bus line that was started in Seoul, in South Korea. And what happened was that if you take the buses on this bus line, bus route, they're not supposed to have any drivers, right? There's this picture that the BBC took where you can see this person sitting on the driver's wheel, but he's got his hands raised. I like how he's also raising his, legs and his feet to show you that he's not touching anything and the bus is driving itself. But this picture begs a question, which is why is still, someone sitting in the driver's seat, right? So if this car or this bus is supposed to be self-driving, what is this driver doing there? Well, it turns out that, very often these self-driving vehicles have these backup drivers sitting behind the wheel, because the idea is that, they claim, just as an example, these self-driving vehicles, they're, super smart, they're reliable 99.99% of the time. But what this means to me is that this backup driver have to stay at the wheel and be super vigilant 100% of the time, right? And they need to have split-second reflexes just so that they're able to catch the 0.01% of the time, just in case the vehicle makes a mistake, to prevent the vehicle from hitting someone. And this is not a theoretical problem. So Uber has also been running so-called self-driving taxis for several years now in some different countries. And in this case, in the US, there was this unfortunate fatal accident where someone died when they were hit by a self-driving Uber taxi. But during the criminal investigations, they found that Uber was not liable for this accident. They said that, it was because the backup driver, they were distracted by a screen. They were not paying enough attention. So it turns out that it was actually the backup driver that was criminally liable for hitting someone and killing them in this crash. And they actually had to go to jail. Now, in this case, the worker's job was literally to sit and wait to take the blame for accidents. And I was talking about surveillance of workers earlier, and Amazon again does this. So, in the name of safety, some Amazon delivery vehicles come with these so-called AI cameras that are constantly looking at the faces of their delivery drivers. For example, it will look at whether their eyeballs are pointed in the right direction. And there are also reports that sometimes those AI cameras are even looking at the lips of those drivers because they're not allowed to sing as they drive. So if someone is caught singing as they're driving these delivery vehicles, they might be penalized. They might be paid less. They might miss the bonus at the end of the week. And these kind of phenomenon that I've been talking about, there are some academic research on it as well. For example, the economist Dan Davis calls these people accountability sinks because they are the powerless cogs in the machine who have to take on all of the risks and liabilities, right? Another term that I think is very powerful came from Professor Madeleine Ehrlich. And in her paper, she calls these people the moral chromosomes. So chromosomes are the front sections of a car that gets crushed when the car runs into something, right? And the idea is that this compression of this front part of the car will take on some of the impact so that the impact doesn't go onto the human driver. And that really increases the survival of humans in car crashes. Except that when you are talking about moral chromosomes, the idea is that the worker is the chromosome and the technology is the one that is being protected. One more quick example I want to talk about when it comes to moral chromosomes is in journalism. So earlier this year, there's this newspaper called the Chicago Sun-Times in the US, and they were caught where they published the summer reading list, and it's got this list of recommended books, and it turns out that the books don't exist at all. And then they interviewed the journalist who supposedly wrote this article, and they admitted that they were under so much pressure. They used chatbots to help them write this article, and they felt really sorry. They said, I can't believe I missed it. It's so obvious, no excuses. I'm completely embarrassed by my mistake. Now, on the surface of this, it looks like, that this journalist is really sorry for making a mistake. But the bigger point is that over many years, newspapers in the US have been firing a lot of journalists for many years and for many different reasons. And more work has been piled onto the few journalists that still remain. So under so much pressure, they resort to chatbots to take on some of the load. And because the chatbot, doesn't really do a good job, but the journalist is so busy, sometimes things fall through the crack. So the digital activist Cory Doctorow describes this really well when he said that AI can't do our jobs, but an AI salesman can convince your boss to fire you and replace you with an AI that cannot do your job. And this happens all the time, which comes back to my point that artificial intelligence is very much a marketing term. It is a facade of usefulness, and it fools the bosses of the workers that I just talked about. But it is not just in these stories. I think this illusion affects all of us. So there's this online digital newspaper called Rest of World, and in a very amazing article, they have a reporter called Viola Zhou, who wrote about her mother who lives in China, and her mother needs to have regular doctor checkups for her kidney because she had a kidney transplant. But her mother feels that the doctors don't care about her enough, and they don't have enough time to really pay attention to her and to answer her questions. So she would rather, do her medical consultations with the very famous DeepSeek chatbot instead, because her mother said, DeepSeek is so patient, it answers all of my questions, and it really cares about my medical conditions, right? So on one hand, these so-called AI companies are more than happy to profit from our use of their chatbots for things like medical advice, even though they often give you incorrect information, right? On one hand, they're more than happy for us to use it this way. On the other hand, it was also just reported earlier this year that if you look at the usage policy of OpenAI, which is the maker of ChatGPT, they updated the small text that is in their usage policy to say that you're not supposed to use ChatGPT for legal or medical advice. So which one is it, right? Are you supposed to be using these chatbots for medical advice or not? And I think what's going on is that so-called artificial intelligence might feel very convenient and intelligent and even caring. But that illusion seduces us into giving away our power while we have to retain all of the risks and liabilities. So in a sense, we are all becoming the moral chromosomes in this technical societal arrangement. And I think that is really unfortunate. And the illusion of AI, also distracts us from existing systemic problems, right? For example, why is the healthcare system broken so that the doctor doesn't have enough time to pay attention to their patients, right? Why are teachers so overworked that they feel they can't take good enough care of, their students? And imagine if instead of pouring the billions and billions and billions of dollars that we're currently putting into so-called artificial intelligence, if we just used a bit of those same resources to actually fix these existing structural problems, right? Then what kind of world could we be in that would be so much better? And meanwhile, as all of these problems are happening, we are also giving up on the future of our planet. So I think, as a lot of you know, AI technologies that are run in these enormous data centers that are being built all over the world right now. And data centers consume an enormous amount of energy, right? They're physically big and they use a ton of electricity. So the International Energy Agency have studied the energy use of data centers over the past years. And in one of their reports from last year, it estimates that the data centers in the country of Ireland will use up to 32% of that entire country's electricity consumption by 2026. That's almost a third of that entire country's energy use, which I think is absolutely remarkable. You know, of everything that requires electricity, right? Data centers could use up to a third of everything in your country. And another remarkable discovery in their report from this year is that they were estimating, the growth of electricity demand for data centers globally, and they estimate that by 2030, they would use 945 terawatt hours of electricity per year. So how much is that? That is more than the entire electricity consumption of all of Japan today. That is a huge amount of energy that's being used by these data centers, running statistical models that cannot think or understand. Now, of course, in addition to electricity, these data centers also consume an enormous amount of water. And it's not just any kind of water. For these data centers, they're often very picky in that they have to use very clean, drinkable water. And they use that very clean, drinkable water and potable water for evaporative cooling. So they will soak up, water from the rivers, filter them to cool their servers, and then the water evaporates and goes away. And the cruel irony is that some of these data centers are being built in even some of the driest planets on Earth. For example, Spain suffers from a lot of droughts. And The Guardian did an investigation of the water use by data centers recently, and they were interviewing Aurora Gomez, who is an activist in Spain. And I think she said it really well. Your cloud is drying up my river. And this is literally happening to many rivers around the world, including on the other side of the world in Chile. So unfortunately, Chile is also going through a record drought right now, and they don't think the drought is even going to let up until the year 2040. But dozens of data centers are already in Chile, and more are being built right now. And in a recent report, again by Rest of World, they looked at the new data centers that are being built in Chile. And one of the new data centers called Carrillos is estimated to use 228 liters of water every second. That's more than 7 billion liters of water every year for one single data center. And it's sucking up, the water from all of the rivers in that area that could have been used by the humans who actually live there. So, water and electricity, these are just two examples of some of the resource extraction that happens behind so-called artificial intelligence that's becoming a lot worse. I haven't even talked about, things such as the fact that because the computations are so intensive, the physical hardware and the server equipment in these data centers, they burn out really quickly. And it's creating a lot of e-waste that's causing a lot of pollution. And I don't even have time to go into that today. So, when considering everything that I've been describing today, there was this special issue in the MIT Technology Review, where they have a bunch of articles describing how so-called AI technologies is actually a new form of colonialism. So, this is in terms of both the extraction of natural resources around the world by these, very expensive tech companies in Silicon Valley. It is also the exploitation of humans and click workers in the global south. And one of the authors for one of the articles in the series is called Karen Howe. And she recently published a book called Empire of AI. And in the book, she goes into a lot of detail into the history of OpenAI, the company that makes ChatGPT. And in the book, she reflects and makes comparisons where she discovered that, what's happening today is very similar to, those huge companies back, 200 years ago during European colonization, such as the East India Company. But, rather than the East India Company, it is the Googles and the Microsofts and the Amazons and the OpenAIs of today that are the new East India companies that are colonizing the world. So we've learned that so-called artificial intelligence is not a magical thinking machine that can do anything. These technologies are not nearly as useful as they are hyped up to be. They're neither artificial nor intelligent, and they consistently exploit human laborers who have to create this illusion of intelligence while obeying these moral chromosomes, right? The language and marketing about AI robs us of our power and agencies, allowing these tech companies to create the moral chromosomes and accountability things where they profit while we take on all of the societal and environmental costs, right? Another term that describes this really well is that these companies, they are privatizing the gains and they are socializing the costs. And this is a modern form of imperialism under the guise of automation and convenience. So what do we do about these problems? Well, I will give my best attempt at making some suggestions based on my reflections. In the limited time I have left, I'd like to cover 4 kind of large categories of things that we might be able to do. But I want to stress that this is not a comprehensive list. And I would love to learn from you in terms of more things that we could be doing together. But the first category is that let's not anthropomorphize these technologies. As I have said multiple times today, words matter, right? What do you mean when you say artificial intelligence? Can you be more specific in terms of what you're actually talking about? And either don't use the term artificial intelligence at all, or at least not perpetuate the myth that it is intelligent. And this is not just in terms of words, but also in other forms such as visuals. So if you look at the news today, for news reports about artificial intelligence, they will often accompany those articles by, a humanoid-looking robot, right? And those visuals perpetuate the myth that these are things that can think just like humans, right? So it is words, but it is also more than words in terms of how we communicate around these technologies. The other thing is that there's this person called Stefano Quintarelli, who was a member of parliament in Italy. And interestingly enough, he suggested that instead of AI, we could be calling them systematic approaches to learning algorithms and machine inference. Now, this sounds like a mouthful, and why is there so many words, right? Well, if you look at the first letter in each of these words, they spell out salami. And Stefano asks us that, hey, when you see someone talking about AI, try to replace every instance of AI with salami and see if what they're still saying makes sense, right? So it sounds like a joke, but salami challenges us to take a moment to reflect before adopting or even embracing so-called artificial intelligence. Something that I find very useful to do is to ask yourself, can you rephrase what you're saying without using the term AI? How would you describe your work without using that term? And if you find yourself struggling to describe it, then that's a reminder to think more deeply about what you are actually trying to do. And this brings me to my next point, which is to consider very, very carefully, what problems are we actually solving? So on an individual level, we have to be very mindful of if and why we want to offload a task to, for example, a chatbot, right? Are we missing the point? Is there something we're forgetting? Are we skipping something that we should be doing? For example, if I'm a student and I'm being asked to write an essay, I am supposed to go through the struggle of coming up with that essay because I'm practicing, the muscle. That is my critical thinking, right? And the synthesis of information and communicating that information through words. So if I offload that to a chatbot, I'm missing the point of what I'm doing as a student. The other thing is that rather than falling for the seductive illusion of an all-knowing magical thinking machine that can do everything, let us focus on specific applications of specific technologies with clearly defined uses and constraints. So one example is audio transcription, right? And audio transcription from audio to text has become more accurate on some really advanced machine learning models. One data set I really like as an example is the Mozilla Common Voice data set, which was collected in a really equitable way. Which brings me to the point that even if you have these clearly defined inputs, outputs, and very specific applications, you still have to consider the entire pipeline and supply chain of the technology. Were the training data collected and processed in an equitable way? Are there biases that might have been built in, such as different uses of language or different accents? And how is that mitigated, right? Another specific thing is that when it comes to artificial intelligence, a lot of people say, oh, we just need to have humans in the loop. But on a broader level, this is often a euphemism for moral chromosomes. So we also have to avoid that. The other thing I want to quickly mention on this topic is to go back to Professor Neil Postman. So he studied media ecology, and he gave this lecture in 1997. That's what, almost 30 years ago, called The Surrender of Culture to Technology. And in that lecture, he said that whenever someone proposes a new technological solution, we should always ask 6 basic questions. I'm going to briefly tell you those 6 questions, and then I'm going to try to sum it up. So the first question is, what is the problem to which this technology is the solution? Followed by whose problem is it, right? And then which people and what institutions might be seriously harmed by this solution? Or what new problems might be created because we have solved this so-called problem? The 5th question is, what sort of people and institutions might acquire special economic and political power because of this technological change? And the last question, which really hits at the heart of AI, is what changes in language are being enforced by these new technologies? And what is gained and lost by such changes? So I just listed the 6 questions that Neil Postman posed of a new technology, but I think the short summary is that we have to be very mindful of what problems we're actually solving, right? Whose problem is it? And who or what the benefit is, and who is actually benefiting from this so-called technological solution. Okay, so the third categories of things I like to talk about is the fact that individual action is very important, but individual action alone isn't enough to solve a lot of these systemic problems, just as we cannot individually recycle our way out of the climate crisis. An unfortunate example happened, I think it was May of this year. So this is Ursula von der Leyen, and she is the president of the European Commission. And earlier this year, she gave a speech during the European Union's annual budget meeting. And in the speech, of course, she mentioned so-called AI technology. And she said that we thought AI would approach human reasoning by around 2050. Now we expect this to happen already by next year, which is 2026. Now, as I've emphasized ad nauseum today, AI is neither artificial nor intelligent. So this is the first thing. But on top of this, there were some scientists who were really concerned by this very hyped up statement. So they actually sent a request to the European Commission asking them, hey, what evidence was Ursula von der Leyen using when she made this statement? And the European Union actually responded. And it turned out that when von der Leyen was making her speech, she was quoting directly from the CEOs of Anthropic and OpenAI, who are two of the biggest AI companies, right? And I use this example to say that we have to avoid regulatory capture. When it comes to a lot of public policy, often the government would say, we need to get the experts' opinions on this. But very often, the so-called experts that they ask are only from the private sector, and we need to look far beyond that. So there is a lot of policy work going on. One example is the Green Screen Coalition, which brought together several digital advocacy groups to sign a joint statement on limiting the environmental impacts of so-called AI for policymakers. There are a bunch of other groups. For example, there is the AI Now Institute and the Distributed AI Research Institute there. They do a lot of amazing work on equity and justice issues in so-called artificial intelligence. There's also Open Future. So they look at many things, but it includes looking at the importance of open source technologies to underlie artificial intelligence so that the people behind it can be held accountable. There's also Aspiration Tech. So I have been really lucky to be one of their fellows this year as part of their AI openness and equity leadership cohort. And we are actually creating 6 policy recommendations when it comes to more just and equitable AI. It is also very important to support organized labor. So for example, the Distributed AI Research Institute, they've been running a project called the Data Workers Inquiry to highlight the problems faced by the digital sweatshop workers that I've been talking about. And their stories really inspire me because at the beginning of 2025, the click workers in Kenya, they formed the Data Labelers Association, which is a workers' union that is fighting for better working conditions and pay for the traumatic work that they've been doing for years. And it's not just in Kenya. For example, gig workers in Indonesia are also organizing in a similar way. And it is actually not even just these click workers. So on the other side of the power equation, there is this website called the Tech Worker Handbook. And it is specifically for workers in these big tech companies, empowering them to speak up against the injustices that are being done by their companies, and educating them on legal ways of whistleblowing and uncovering a lot of the malpractice that is being done by these companies. And on the point of worker organization, I think it's important to realize that we are all workers. We might be different kinds of workers, whether we're researchers, teachers, drivers, nurses, journalists, tech workers, and so many other kinds of workers, right? And we might face different problems in our domains, but we also share many of the same problems, such as the fact that we are being manipulated by these so-called AI companies. And solidarity between workers in different domains allow us to pool together our resources and efforts so that we can start to take some of the power back. When it comes to policy, sometimes it's very overwhelming to make change on the international or even national level. So one more thing I want to mention before I end is that sometimes, you can start locally, such as the case of this district in the Canadian city of Toronto. So this was several years ago. I think it started back in 2019 or something. So they wanted to develop an entire urban district, right? And there was this company called Sidewalk Labs, which is yet another Google company. They almost took over the entire redevelopment of this district, claiming that they will, use artificial intelligence to turn it into the sparkling smart city. But the local community successfully fought back against this takeover by working directly through Toronto's city government. And what's really inspiring was that this whole process was started by one person called Bianca Wiley, where she just went to one of the city government's meetings and she asked, hey, why are we suddenly letting this enormous company take over an entire city district and automating everything? What is the benefit for us who actually live there? And starting with this question, she galvanized it into an entire movement that eventually, pushed Sidewalk Labs away, where the community can actually have a say in how that district is being redeveloped. And there's actually one more last thing I want to say, which is that it is okay to say no. So what I mean is that last year I had a conversation with an undergraduate student at my university. And she told me that, once there was this one time where she was drafting an essay that she had to write for class. And she asked one of her classmates to give feedback on the essay that she's writing, right? It sounds pretty normal to me and to her, but her classmate said to her, you can just show your essay to ChatGPT. Why are you wasting my time to give feedback on your essay? And I think this is a very important example that with many different technologies, we have to avoid a situation where somehow you are the crazy person for not using a particular technology. And right now, there's a lot of marketing hype about so-called human-centered AI. You can see this on Microsoft's website about their Copilot assistant. This screenshot is from the IBM blog about human-centered AI. But if we actually want technology to be human-centered, then that surely means that, we are allowed to say no, right? At the end of the day, how are we humans if we're not even allowed to say yes or no to something? So something that is always in our control is that we do not have to be like that classmate I mentioned. We have to maintain a culture where it is normal and where it is acceptable for our fellow humans to refuse the use of a particular piece of technology. So that is, the last message I want to leave with you today. There's so much more that we could discuss. So very quickly as I end, I just want to end with some further reading. I mentioned some books. There's the book called AI Snake Oil that talks about the technology behind so-called artificial intelligence. I mentioned Empire of AI by Karen Hao, who talks about comparing, the ancient East India companies to the modern tech companies of today. I mentioned Emily Bender earlier. She and Alex Hanna wrote a book called The AI Con on how these companies are creating a lot of these hype and illusions. And if you don't have time to read all of these books, they also have a podcast called Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000, which is a really wacky name, where they use an entertaining way to poke at the bubble that is so-called AI hype. So that's some of the reflections that I have for you today. Thank you so much again for your time. Thank you so much to Professor Chen and for ChengChi for organizing today's event. I'm really grateful to be here with you today. Here is a link to download the editable slides, including notes and references to all of the stories and papers I mentioned, or you can just scan the QR code on your screen. Thank you so much for having me. Any questions?
Could you hear me? Could you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah,
Hi.
okay. Yeah, did you hear people's applaud?
Actually, I didn't hear anything. Were you on mute just now? Thank you.
See people here from my screen. So Peiqi is helping me in my screen.
Thank you.
It's not on.
I can see the room. Oh,
Okay.
well, I can see part of the room. I can see about 5 or 6 people.
Okay, let me see if I can.
I feel like my head is sitting on one of the desks facing the audience.
This one? Okay, yeah, good. Yeah, okay, so we can see you, we can see ourselves.
Great.
And so, yeah, thanks, Pen, for this really, really wonderful lecture that he not only, I think this is like really dedicated preparation for us. Really rare chance for having him, remotely in this kind of crazy time, early morning. When Pan was talking about this the Uber for nurse kind of program, the app, I was a bit shocked because recently NCCU staff receiving an offer from this Uber One that all the NCCU teaching staff were able to enjoy the benefits from having this subscription and all the kind of benefits package from Uber One. And then ever since then, I tried several times. And when I didn't take the ride, and then my cell phone would pop up with a notification telling me that you haven't tried our Uber One recently. So I kind of realized that, all connected, how my Line app, Line Taxi, and my Uber One is doing to me, like kind of supervising my journeys and looking at what my, all my kind of daily commute. And so, yeah, thanks for making all this with like really kind of cruel sense. So any questions for Pen? Like lots of information, right?
Yeah, sorry. I know I've been speaking for a long time. I'm just impressed that not everyone is asleep yet. So thank you for staying awake.
Yeah, Astrid, could you come up and yeah.
Hello. Well, first of all, while I was listening to your lecture, I was building rebuttals for my family about AI because, Lunar New Year is coming up and, the relatives will ask, oh, what are you going to do in the future? And the AI trend, it's like so hot now. Are you going to one of those companies and stuff? So like I was taking photos of all of your references that you put. Do you know that like, yeah, people in Kenya are blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I was building rebuttal in my mind. I'm preparing for the Lunar New Year. So you also talked about how the relationship with a Chinese mom with deep-sick about her disease. So I was wondering if you have any advice for elderly who might not have the chance to listen to your lectures or understand all the concept that you were talking about. Do you have any tips for us in a not too challenging way for us to communicate with our parents or elderlies on this topic?
For me, it seems like it's a very practical kind of questions about preparing for the New Year bombing.
Yes.
Is there any kind of non-AI greetings?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your question. First of all, because I might not be there by the time, let me say a happy Lunar New Year to you first in advance. So I hope you still have a very happy family gathering. And thank you for that question. It is indeed actually really difficult to have these conversations. I think unfortunately, I don't have a perfect answer for you. And I think it will be very challenging to talk about this. But there are two things I can say as kind of like a direction that you can consider. The first one is actually very, very specific. So I should have shown it on my screen. I'm going to put it into the chat for this Google Meet meeting right now. It is a website by one of my colleagues. And the website is literally called aimyths.org. So aimyths.org. Sorry, I really should have put it on the screen. But this website, basically dispels almost all of the myths that will come up in conversations with family members like this. So that is a very practical thing. Unfortunately, it is in English, so I wish someone could translate it. It would be kind of ironic if someone actually uses one of those chatbots to translate this website. But anyway, the second thing I wanted to say is that often with family members, because we care about them so much, right? Our care for them actually becomes one of the reasons for conversations turning into arguments because we feel so strongly about trying to get certain points across. I think this is even true in political discussions, right? Which can be very tricky. And I think a similar situation comes when talking to people about, the technologies that we rely on so much. And the principle that I like to mention is what's called the Socratic method, right? Where rather than saying, what you're using, what you're saying, or what you're doing is really bad, and this is the reason why, and you shouldn't do that, you just come from a place of genuine curiosity and ask them, oh, interesting. So looks like, you're using, this particular technology. Can you tell me about it, right? Why are you using it? Why do you like it so much? And then within that conversation, you can help them to reflect more deeply on their own choices. And as part of the conversation, you can then share with them, hey, by the way, I also read from the AI Myths website that this is actually what's happening. Like, do you share the same understanding? Can we talk about this? So use more of this kind of questioning where you come from a place of genuine curiosity to start a conversation. And in my experience, that makes things slightly easier, but still very challenging, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. Because I'm also interested in the coaching methods. So yeah, it suddenly reminds me that
There you go.
coaching conversation often start with curiosity. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for the question.
Any other questions? Or reflections? Yep.
Or critiques?
Okay. Hi, my name is Teresa, and I'm a master's student here. And I thought your presentation was really engaging. Thank you so much for sharing about like all your findings and everything. And I guess I'm really curious in your research, have you found like what is the right amount of AI or like how to properly use AI in like these fields that you raised up from nursing to education? Like, has that come up in your discussions and the recommendation policies that you raised up yourself? So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. It is a great question. So I really appreciate your question, but I cannot help but nitpick your question first. So allow me to nitpick and say that, what do you mean by AI? What technology are you talking about, right? So having said that, getting to your question, I think there are several things here, and I can't take all the credit for this. It is part of many conversations I've had over the past few years. So the first thing is that again, like I said, maybe we don't need to use this technology for a particular purpose or to solve a particular problem. Maybe there are other solutions to a problem. And like Neil Postman said, we have to think about whose problem is it, right? In the example of the hospital, it was actually the hospital's problem. They wanted to save costs, right? And then the other thing is that I mentioned some of those organizations earlier near the end of my talk, such as the Distributed AI Research Institute or AI Now. And they've actually done some studies and some really good reporting on how these so-called AI technologies can be used in more equitable ways. For example, there's this article, again, in MIT Tech Review that says, okay, we have these large language models. Surely there's something good that we can do with them. And it was actually the indigenous Maori people in New Zealand who are, they are at risk of losing their language and culture, right? But, rather than a big company like Microsoft or OpenAI or Google coming in, they use the same principles to develop their own large language models that allows them to, model their own indigenous language in a way where all the way from the beginning of the data collection down to the usage of those models, it is under the community's own control. And I think this is a good example because it is actually not often a matter of the technology itself. It is the people and the social structures around that technology and how people are involved and actually have a say in how that technology is used. That is so important for making it work, right? And this cannot be performative. So, for example, in the first hospital example I mentioned, where all of the patients are reduced down to numbers for the level of severity, the hospital would say, oh, we've consulted our nurses, right? But that was done in a completely, performative way. And then, when the nurses said, hey, we don't think this is actually going to help us. If you give us a number representing the situation of a patient, that number doesn't mean anything to us. But if you give me a minute to actually interact with the patient, I can make a much better judgment on how the patient is doing. I don't even need this technology. But the hospital actually ended up listening to the AI salesman rather than the nurses, who are the core stakeholders here, right? So being very mindful of what communities you're actually engaging with and involving is a very important part of the consideration. I hope that answers part of your question.
Any other questions or reflections? Eve.
Hello.
Hi.
I don't know how to phrase, if I'm able to phrase my question properly, but I'm thinking about also in relation to AI or from a student perspective, language models, large language models that basically make text production not a task anymore that requires critical mostly. And now I'm thinking a lot if you have any recommendations or sources for people who might have thought about how we can develop teaching, on one hand, didactical methods, and on the other hand, proper assessment exercises that cannot be circumnavigated with the use of AI tools in the broad category. Do you have any source in that direction or know of someone?
Yeah, thank you for the question about, I guess, education, right? So, I agree with you, and as I've acknowledged near the beginning of my talk, a lot of absurdities are happening in education. Students would write a PhD application letter using ChatGPT, and then the same professors will use the same tool to turn it back into bullet points. Or Google and OpenAI are really big on pushing these chatbots into education and wanting to use it to replace teachers. But I think getting to a point of, how to deal with the specific situation where you want to either observe situations where students are circumventing the education process with the use of these chatbots. People have tried a number of different solutions, and I think they're good and bad in different ways. Well, actually, this is not a super obvious one. Some of you might know this, but some people don't. So what happens is that there are some educators who say, hey, you know what? These chatbots are becoming so popular and being used everywhere. Let us just incorporate that into our education. So let's have an entire lesson where we just have the students, use these chatbots to do some of their work. But the meta level education is that as we do this in the lesson, we ask the students to critically reflect on the technologies and see where it goes wrong and where it's producing unwanted outputs and why it's often not very useful. So I can appreciate that some educators are doing this, and I can see some benefits here. However, my problem with this kind of solution is that, it really is these chatbots creating a new problem with which we have to spend extra time away from doing other things to do lessons like this. You know what I'm saying? If we didn't have to use these chatbots, then we could have been spending this time on doing something else that's more productive and educational. So I think it is unfortunate in that sense. Another thing is that I know in some classrooms, they're just going back to very old school analog ways of assessment, right? Which is what I experienced as a student. So for example, during an exam where I have to answer questions or write essays, like we're not allowed to bring any like computer or digital equipment into the room. We have to do everything on paper, right? That is, what some educators are doing. And frankly, I think this is a very challenging situation for education because in addition to some of these imperfect solutions, it is also just so tempting because educators are so overworked to just offload some of that work to these chatbots. But I'm actually quite curious if Hong Ying has more experience in this regard that maybe she can tell us about.
Yeah, I think that really speaks to a lot of us struggling in like the temptation of using AI to solve all kinds of work. And like even now, like we had a kind of teachers chat across different universities, talking about the kind of, there are probably two different branches, but like the mainstream branch about like AI in education would be that ethically we shouldn't ban a student from using AI in doing all this because we ourselves also use. So then
Yes.
that's like, that's not like really solving the core issue, right? It's not like because of this overwhelmed of workload that permit you and legitimate your use of AI in solving teaching loads. So I think that's really the dilemma. And I'm also seeing very similar type of dilemma happening in environmental movements. Yesterday, we invited an environmental activist who has been engaging in different kind of fights against the expansion of scientific parks in Taiwan. And then so we were chatting about there's this kind of international coalition. They try to build and reconnect about, for example, currently Taiwan is taking over like kind of this huge amount of expansion in data centers, the expansion of this chip manufacturing company like foundries or different things. So then the current US reclaiming back of this chip production seems to be a positive move for them because Taiwan basically its carrying capacity cannot take up these huge amounts of demands from the world, and so they think that decentralizing is a positive move, more kind of pragmatically speaking. But then in the meantime, it's kind of tricky to see how environmental activists inevitably, get it also caught in the dilemma that on one hand you see how AI related jobs are, kind of plummeting that in everywhere. And so I was asking like, how do environmental activists in US reacting to this current trend? And he answered that they were also really caught in between. Before they were the people who kept the manufacturing part out of the Silicon Valley, but then now they are reclaiming it back, and they cannot resist because of people needing jobs. And so they are trying to strike a new balance between this, and then trying to see if the kind of engagement in technological advancement can help, making it the entire manufacturing process a more like cleaner one. So yeah, I also wonder like, how do you view all this?
Oh, this
And
is
how does that like do this similar kind of branching process, bifurcation in different like strands also happen in the open science community?
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's a very big question. I think what you're describing, you said really well how pervasive and perverse the problems around so-called AI technologies is, because it permeates into so many aspects of society. But I think what you're also describing is that these different domains in society that are experiencing these problems, the nature of these problems are very similar, right? You face, as you said, this dilemma of being seduced into this technology because you are already overwhelmed trying to solve the issues in your domain, right? While realizing the perverse impact of this technology on the problems that you are trying to solve. And my first reaction is that this is actually, a segue into, the solidarity that I mentioned, So this is a little bit abstract, but, I was trained as an ecologist, right? And as an ecologist, I was taught about how all of the different life on this planet are connected to each other and affect each other in different ways, right? And the concept of ecology is really important because there might be someone who really cares about, a particular species of bird that is endangered in the forest on one side of the world, and there might be environmental activists who really care about, the ozone layer, right, and how it's being depleted. However, or there could be someone else who really cares about, environmental issues in agriculture. But ecology reminds us that all of these seemingly different problems are connected and share the same underlying problems. Now, in the environment, that could be things like climate change, right? And it was the concept of ecology that was able to galvanize the environmental movements in the 20th century to bring these different movements together so that they have more collective power to fight back against those environmental problems, such as climate change, and that really made a huge difference. We wouldn't be where we are today if it weren't for those activists. So when it comes to these different technologies, I think I'd just like to go back to my original point about how it manifests itself in different parts of society, but we have to realize that we're actually connected by this common problem. And by coming together, then maybe we can start pushing back a little bit. Unfortunately, that is not a solution in itself, but I admit I don't have a good answer. I share your struggles, and I would love to learn more about specific solutions that we can come up with. And the one thing I would just say to end my comment is that, I think it's pretty rich of these AI companies to say that, okay, don't quote me on this, but I think it was Eric Schmidt, who was, the CEO of Google, in one of his lectures, I think it was at Stanford University or something. He said, oh, we don't have to worry about climate change anymore. These artificial intelligence technologies, they're going to become so smart that, we don't need to worry about putting all of the electricity into them, all the carbon emissions for the data centers today, because the AI is going to solve climate change for us. I think that is such a scam. So at least we have to avoid this kind of thinking and falling into those traps.
Yeah, I feel like I really learned a lot. Like it's a thinking journey today and also for the long run. So thank you, Pen, for having this really inspiring lecture, and also thanks all of you having the patience. Like we kind of skip our break, and so
no.
Yeah. So I'm going to give them a long break. So let's thank Pen for offering this really wonderful lecture, and that's send him back to bed. Okay, so let's say goodbye.
Thank you so much for having me.
And just probably one final question. I wonder,
yes,
are you planning to probably share this probably on YouTube, or are you allowing us to share this kind of recording later on to some people who might be interested?
Yes, of course. I would be honored for you to share the recording in any way that you see fit. As you see, I've already published this presentation on Zenodo. You can follow the link on your screen or use the QR code to find the editable presentation slides. And there's also a PDF version that comes with all of the notes and references. So if you can add a recording on top of that, I would be a little embarrassed, but also honored.
So in that sense, I will probably send the recording back to you, and then so that you can integrate into one, like the DOI that you have already published. Do you think that's a better idea?
I'm happy with that as well. And if there's anywhere else you like to put it, I'm happy for you to do that too. Okay.
Thank you, Pen, and see you.
Yes, thank you so much for having me today. Really grateful to be here. And have a great rest of the afternoon.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.